Firstly, I'll just introduce myself and our company. Some of you may not know us or what we do. Bintani is a wholesale ingredient supplier to the brewing industry. We carry a range of malt, yeast and hops. We import products from all around the world, and we do Australian hops through Tim, which have been extremely successful. There are some great varieties coming out of Tassie and Victoria, so that's been good. Today talking about malt, Bintani, we carry 4 main varieties of malt. We do Joe White malt, that's the Australian-based maltster here. We bring in UK malt from Simpsons. We bring in German malt from Best Malts. Best Malts are an amalgamation of 2 old German malting families, the Palatial Malt and Höfner Malt companies. So that's been great. The Best Malt's excellent. And we also do Briess Malt out of the US, which is our most recent addition to the lineup. Most of you guys will probably have heard of Briess. I don't know if many have brewed with it. I think we've had it for less than 12 months here in Australia, so I'm not sure how wide it's spread into the home brewing community. It's a pretty famous company from the US. So they're our 4 main brands, and my talk will focus largely on those ones because they're the products that I'm most familiar with. I'm not a maltster, I'm not a grower. We do a fair bit of home brewing in the warehouse at work. We've got a 50-litre pilot plant, so a lot of my knowledge comes from that, and I guess anecdotal evidence from the brewers that we deal with. The talk today will be basically split into 2 sections, from barley to malt, the growing and the malting of the barley, which I'll try and rip through pretty quick because I think we're running a little bit behind time. And then we'll look at a couple of varieties and their uses. We carry, I think, somewhere between 60 and 70 malt varieties at any one time, so it's hard to look at all of them, but I'll look at a couple of the more interesting and the more unique types that, well, in my opinion, that are out there at the moment. Okay, I guess probably the first thing is the growing conditions are pretty important for the barley, and they have a big impact on what's produced, and there are significant differences between the growing conditions around the world. Once again, I'll look at the 4 sort of areas that we deal with mainly. The UK is traditionally known for having really well-modified malt. Whatever you think about the UK weather, it's actually very good for growing malt in the areas where it's grown. They have long daylight hours during the growing season, and they have what they call a maritime climate, where the temperature extremes aren't quite as bad as what they are in continental Europe. So then they get a lot of fog, which also helps lock moisture in. So they get long daylight hours, plenty of water, and they actually grow some of the finest barley in the world. And this has contributed to the brewing tradition in the UK. Having access to really good, consistent, well-modified malt meant that they could utilise a single-step infusion mash, and that's what their industry is based on, and that's as a result of having this good malt available. The reason it works so well over there is they get good, big, plump grains that modify really evenly and really nicely in the malt house. So it's to do with the climate and also selecting varieties that work well there. The main pale malt now that comes out of the UK is Marisota. That's a pretty well-known variety. Golden Promise is a Scottish variety, and it's a really early yielder, so that's enabled malt to be grown in Scotland. So it's just selecting the right variety for the right conditions. Germany, traditionally under-modified malt. I don't actually know why they've had traditionally under-modified malt. It's had a big impact on their brewing tradition, though, with the advent of decoction mashing and the pale lagers that are a result of that. So the German malt is excellent, and the malt you get nowadays out of Germany is not under-modified. So it has changed, but traditionally it was, and that's why decoction mashing was popular in Germany. In the US, in the early days, two-row was introduced in the coastal areas, and it did all right. But as the industry moved inland, they found that six-row malt or six-row barley grew better. Six-row traditionally is higher protein and higher diastatic power. So this had an impact on their industry over there, where they were able or forced, depending on which way you look at it, to use high levels of adjunct, mainly corn and rice. So that's had a big impact on the US brewing scene. Six and two-row malting barley nowadays, the difference is that the gap is closing, where you can get very high diastatic power two-row, and you can get lower protein six-row. So the differences aren't quite so great as they used to be, and that's just selective breeding over the last 20 odd years or so. In Australia, we have very, very different growing conditions from what they have in the UK or the USA and Canada. It's hot here and it's dry, and we use extensive agriculture. It's all dry land farming, but it works really well. Our malt here out of Australia is excellent, and it's renowned around the world now. We are the second largest exporting country in the world. We don't grow, I think we're about 5% of the total barley growth in the world, but we export a lot, and most of it goes into Southeast Asia. So it's well-renowned malt. I know a lot of people look pretty closely to importing malt, and they want German malt for their pilsners and British ale malts for their ales, and it's fine, but it's sort of, you can't ignore the Aussie malt because it is excellent malt, and it's used around the world, and it's very, very well accepted. Everyone does different malts for different markets. Here in Australia, as I said, we export a great deal of our malt, and in Asia, they use a different spec malt than what we tend to use here. In Australia, our commercial beers are brewed with a fairly high level of adjunct, but it's sugar adjunct, so there's no extra diastatic power required from the malt. So they're fairly standard, traditional malts that we produce here. For the export market, they're hot malts. They've got a lot more diastatic power because they're converting cereal adjuncts, a lot of rice in Asia. So they're quite different varieties. The barley strains that are exported are Bull Oak and Bodan. They've got really high diastatic power. The domestic malts here work really well for craft brewing because they don't have huge diastatic power. You can use them for all malt beers, so they do work well in the craft scene and for homebrew as well. Okay, basically the aim of malting is to get access to the starch for the brewer in the brew house. If you have a look at the picture, the red stained part is the embryo or the germ. The white part is the starchy endosperm, and it's surrounded by the husk and the aileron layer. Basically, we need to modify the endosperm cell walls. The starch is locked in a cell wall that's comprised mainly of beta-glucans. We need enzymes that will break that down in the maltings so that we can get access to the starch within these cell walls. So we need to optimise the enzyme synthesis for that to happen. As malting is basically just a controlled germination of the grain to get it to grow, but then stop it when it's at the stage that we need it. So as the barley starts to shoot and grow, it synthesises enzymes that pass into the endosperm and break down these cell walls. So you've got beta-glucanases that carry that out. We need to also hydrolyse some of the protein. The starch is in a protein matrix, so that also needs to be broken down, and there are proteases that do that. Measuring the rate of the protein breakdown is a good indicator of the modification of the malt. If you have too much, you'll end up with a thin, bodiless beer that won't hold head. If you don't break down enough of the protein, you'll have issues in processing, you'll have haze and watering issues. Once we've got it to the stage where we need it, we need to stop the germination basically before any of the starch is degraded and lost. So that's done by kilning, by drying the malt in a kiln. And this contributes colour and flavour development of the barley. So the actual malting process firstly, the grain's received, stored and cleaned. The first part of the actual malting is the steeping, where the barley is wet for 48 hours. In this period, it'll be completely immersed 2 or 3 times. In between that, it'll be given air rests so that the grain can start to respire. And yeah, basically it needs air so it doesn't drown. The germination is once it's steeped and the moisture's hit about 45%, it's sent to a germination chamber where it starts to grow, and basically it's just moist, cool air at about 16 degrees passed through the grain to give it the good conditions so that it can grow. Once it's reached the point where everyone's happy with it and there's plenty of starch available for the brewer, it's sent to the kiln. Processing at this point can change quite different depending on what malt you're looking to make. Pale malt, the typical regime is they'll hit it with 50-degree air for a few hours and start to drive off the moisture. And as it gets drier, you can ramp up the air temperature to about 85 degrees for the final drying. Cleaning and analysis, just to every batch of malt that's produced is analysed for all the different specs that the brewers are looking for. Storage and packing, it's then sent to a silo for packing later on. Packing is always either a 25-kilo bag, 1-ton bulk bag, or silo deliveries, or a ship if you're exporting. So the main varieties, you've got your pale malts, high temp kiln malts, crystal and caramel malts, roast malts, and then specialty malts that don't really fall into any of those categories. The pale malts are fairly straightforward. You'll all be very, very familiar with the whole range of pale malts. The high temp kiln malts include things like your Viennas and your Munichs. They're a slightly different process. It's not just extra heat and time in the kiln to develop the colour and the flavour. Munich malts, for example, they have a 40-degree air-on temperature with little ventilation, so that the grain actually stews a bit and it develops melanoidins, and so that's part of the reason why you get that different flavour characteristic from your Munich malts. Crystal and caramel malts produced on a roaster, and basically green malt heated with no ventilation, so it stews, it liquefies the interior of the barley, and it converts all the starch to sugar in that process, and then it's dried with fairly high heat depending on the colour that you're after, and so it crystallises and you get that crystalline structure through the grain. The roast malts, same way, but instead of using wet malt, they're generally done with Pilsner malt that has typically a higher level of protein, and they basically cook the crap out of them. Temperatures can get up to about 230 degrees for the darkest malts, and it's right near the flash point or the ignition point for these. Fires in the roasters are not uncommon in malting work, so yeah, I think the first number on any maltster's speed dial is a local fire brigade. So yeah. Specialty malts, there's some really interesting different malts around, like you've got your rye malts, your crystal wheats, there's a bunch of very, very interesting malts, and we'll have a look at a couple of them in a minute. I'm not sure, are we going to be able to pass these around without spilling too much malt, you reckon? Yeah, we'll give it a go anyway. Okay, so just a very quick look at, and this gets back to what I was saying before about the degree of modification of modern pale malts. And I've looked at a couple of well-known Pilsner malts here, the Joe White, Best Malts, Global and Wyman, and I've got Simpsons Marisota there just as a reference because it's renowned as being a very well-modified malt. The SNR, or the Kolbach index, the soluble nitrogen ratio, is a pretty well-used indicator of modification, and anything between 36 and 42% is deemed well-modified. And if you look at those numbers there, Marisota is actually the least modified of any of those. So modern malt is well-modified, and it's all well-suited for single-step infusion. I think you'd have to look pretty damn hard to find under-modified malt. It's available, but there's probably not much of it floating around in Australia, I would imagine. Now, Tim, would you be able to pass around the first batch, which there's 4 bags of each variety there. The first one's Breeze Victory malt that I want to have a look at. So, yeah, no, it's not sealed. There's there should be 4 of the Breeze Victory, so just send it to different points in the audience. Yeah, thanks, David. This is a pretty famous malt in the US. Speaking to the distributors over there, this is always one of the top sellers over there. Got a decent amount of colour on it. Biscuity, nutty, sort of like a baking bread character that you get from this one, and it adds a real nice level of complexity, and you can use it in just about any beer. When we brewed with it in a couple of fairly pale ales, and we used it at about 5 or 6%. At that rate, it was almost too much in a light beer. It's a fairly intense flavour. Now, I do apologise. The sample I've got here is not the freshest. It's slightly slack, but you'll get a good indication of what the colour and the flavour are. On the Breeze spec sheet, they recommend using it up to 25% in a dark ale. I've never done that, and I don't know. For me, that's pretty high. It would be pretty intense at that rate. So I don't know. I think some of these specialty malts, just sort of keeping a rein on them is not a bad idea at times. You don't want to overwhelm your beer, but it's a big malt, and it adds a real interesting layer of complexity to a lot of beers. You can use it in an amber lager or any of your ales. Yeah. Has anyone brewed with the Breeze Victory here? Yeah. So how do you find it, John? You
Yeah, it's exactly like you say. It's real biscuity, real nutty.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly. Yeah. All right. Now, I know you guys, some of you won't have yet tasted, but I'll move on to the next one. Simpsons Medium Crystal. I know it's not probably the most exciting malt in the world, but to me, these Simpsons Crystal malts are hands down the best crystal malts I've ever seen. They're unbelievable. When you get a look at them, look at the plumpness of the grain and the colour of it. They're just absolutely spectacular. The flavour is beyond any other crystal malt I've ever tried. That includes Joe Wyatt, the Wyomans, any of them. I think they're different, and it might not work for your beer, but to me, when I think of a crystal malt now, it's the Simpsons Crystals. They're unbelievable. They're sweet, they're complex, they're spectacular, and we've had huge success with these here in Australia. They also do a heritage crystal, which is made from 100% Marisota malt, which I think it's the first time anyone's done a specialty malt like that from Marisota. It's exactly the same colour. When you read the spec sheet, it's basically identical to their normal crystal malts, but the flavour is quite different. So I didn't bring any of that up because I didn't have samples prepared, but if you ever get a chance to try the Simpsons Heritage Crystal and do a comparison of it, it's quite interesting, the difference. All right, now the next one, for me, this is the most interesting malt that I've seen come out in recent times. The Simpsons Golden Naked Oak. It's a pretty unique product, this one. It's a huskless oat malt. It's like a crystal oat malt. It's a unique product. Have a look at it when it comes around. The flavour on this is unbelievable. It's nutty. In the UK, they use it in their ales, basically, just to add a layer of complexity to their ales, a sweet, nutty flavour. I've never tasted a malt like it. I've never seen a malt like it. It's bizarre. I've brewed with it at fairly high rates at times, and it gets overwhelming once again. I wouldn't go above 15%, and for that, I would use that in a darker ale. If you're doing something a bit lighter, keep it lower. It'll quickly overwhelm your beer, but it's a very, very unique flavour, and sorry? It is, isn't it? Yeah. It's bizarre. It's small. I guess running it through the mill, you're not going to get a really fine crush with it. How do you find it, Sean? Yeah. yeah, if you bruise it and break it up a little bit even, it's huskless, so you're not going to have to compete with that, and the enzymes will break it down. So you don't have to flour it or anything, but yeah, most of the commercial brewers who are using it just mix it in with their grist, and they do leave their mill setting the same because it's not quite as easy for a lot of them to change it. But yeah, they have no issues with it, you know, in the grist. So that one, yeah, that one's a very interesting malt. That there's 4 packs of each of these floating around, so whoever ends up with them, feel free to take them and do what you will with them. I didn't bring samples of these, but I just wanted to sort of touch on a couple of the other interesting ones around. Briest dextrin malt. It's basically the same as Wyman Carapils, but legal reasons, trademark and whatnot, they can't call it Carapils here. Wyman can't call theirs Carapils in the US. It's a bizarre malt. I didn't bring any of this up largely because I didn't want broken teeth in the audience. It's the hardest malt I've seen. And it is clear just about and glassy. To get a crystal malt with no colour. I don't know exactly how they do it. John, you might know a little bit more about how the actual process of this, but yeah, it's a very, very interesting malt. When if you get a chance to have a look at that, it's useful in a lot of beers just to add a bit of body, a bit of foam retention. Yeah, you can use it in just about any beer, but yeah, it's one worth having a look at if you get the chance. Best chit malt. This would be the only under-modified malt that I've seen in the country. If you look at the SNR on that, 31.3%, really under-modified. I don't know, we don't sell a lot of this. A couple of people look at it. I think one of the reasons this malt is produced in Germany is so that they can maintain their Reinheitsgebot standing with the beer purity. It's got all the characters of basically of raw barley. So they're not allowed to use raw barley in their brewing. So this is the minimum you can do and call it malt, but it's got the raw barley characteristics. Here in Australia, I'd buy raw barley. Yeah, but it's an interesting one. The Briest rye malt, there's a few good rye beers floating around at the moment, and I think rye works really well in an IPA. It's got that, yeah, there was one at the bar last night which was quite interesting. There's a few I've had that have just been absolutely spectacular rye IPAs, and that sort of, yeah, the rye character works really well with those hop flavours, I think. Got to be careful when you're brewing with it. It's got high glucan content, so it really gums up your mash if you're using it in too high a percentage. I've heard of people using it up to 50%, but I think that's, yeah, you probably need some rice hulls in there to help with your watering. Smoked malt, they're pretty intense malts. I don't particularly like them. I don't really like smoked beer overly. They're produced mainly with beechwood in Germany. In the US, I think Briest do one with a couple of different woods, but most of what you get here at the moment is smoked with beechwood. Smoked ales, yeah, they're not to everyone's taste, but they're interesting. Use it at a high rate, you get bacony flavours. It's yeah, not my cup of tea, but yeah. Briest Midnight Wheat. This is a fairly new one from Briest. It's a debittered roast wheat malt. It doesn't have the astringency that you get from a lot of roast malts, and it's going crazy in the US in their black IPAs and, yeah, just for colouring for a lot of dark beers. There's a few people the craft brewers here who use it in their stouts now, and they find it gives a really mild, mellow character to their stouts. It's a great malt. And they've got a new one also, which I don't think we've received yet, called Black Prince, which is a debittered huskless barley, roast barley, and it's quite an interesting one too. So that's just a look at a couple of the more interesting different malts sort of floating around at the moment. I think we're just about out of time, hey David? Yep, cool. All right, I was going to do a quick talk on the Briest malt extracts, but we can leave that for another time. So before I finish, I read an interesting quote on one of the forums, and to me it pretty much summed up my thoughts on malt. it goes. As a home brewer, if you're looking at the analysis of your malt, the main things I suggest you focus on is colour, enzyme levels and flavour. Colour, because if you're making a light coloured brew, you don't want to use too dark a malt. Also, if you're making a red ale, you want malts that provide some red colour. Enzymes, because you don't want to try and mash with a large quantity of malt that has low enzyme levels such as Munich 10 or 20. Your base malt should have a DP of 100 or better and be at least 50% of the malt bill. It's pretty self-explanatory. Flavour, because that is what you focus on in your finished beer. If you want a certain malt character in your beer, such as maltiness, toffee, chocolate, flavour, etc., you need to select the malt that provides the character. All of those things, such as mealiness, soluble nitrogen ratio, coarse and fine grind extract, sizing and protein, have to do with modification and yield. As homebrewers, yield, or getting that last half a cup of wort out of your grain, is not really all that important. As I mentioned earlier, all the malt available today is well modified. So basically, you're not going to get under-modified malt. The malt you get is going to be pretty good to brew with. The most important thing to look for when you're selecting your malt is, in my opinion, is the flavour. Chew the malt, have a taste of it, and think what you're trying to get in your beer, then select your malt based on that. So yeah, thank you very much for your attention.